Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video I'll be answering 5 of the most common questions about painting in watercolour that I've been asked over the years. If you're learning to paint in watercolour and you need some guidance, I have hundreds of online classes that you can work your way through in the comfort of your own home. I'm an experienced and qualified teacher, so I know how people learn. Head to my website if you want to know more about them. I'll put a link in the description of the video. Okay, question number 1, and this one comes up a lot. What pencil do you use under watercolour? So they want to know what pencil I use to transfer my line drawing onto my watercolour paper. If I draw directly onto the watercolour paper, I will use an HB graphite pencil usually. If I want to transfer a drawing that I've done on another piece of paper, I will often use Sarrel paper. Sarrel paper is a wax-free transfer paper that won't leave wax residue, and it's easy to erase. It comes in different colours. I use graphite. It comes on a roll and I cut it to the size I need. You can use the same piece over and over again. I tape my drawing into place on the watercolour paper so that it won't move. I slip the Sarrel paper underneath my drawing so that it sits on the watercolour paper. Then I use a pencil to trace over my line drawing. The Sarrel paper acts like the old-fashioned carbon paper that we used to use in receipt books years ago. Sarrel paper can be a little messy. Sometimes it'll leave marks where your hand rests against it as you are tracing, but they come off fairly easily. I also like to lighten the lines of the line drawing before I start painting. If you don't have Sarrel paper, you can use a graphite pencil to scribble over the back of your drawing and then tape it in place on the watercolour paper and trace over it. It does the same thing. Other people might use light boxes or projectors to transfer their line drawing to the paper. All right, question number 2. Do you transfer the line drawing before or after you stretch the paper? I always stretch my watercolour paper because I like to paint on paper that remains flat when I work on it. And when I'm finished my painting, I don't have to try and flatten it under some heavy books. Stretching the paper requires soaking it in some water for a short time. And people ask me if I put the drawing on the paper before I soak it in the water or after. I do it after, but you can do it before. For people who use a light box to transfer their drawing, they need to do it before, because once you've stretched your paper, it's attached to a board and you can't use the light box then. If I use graphite, what I've noticed when I put the drawing on the paper first is that the water tends to set the graphite and it makes it a little harder to erase. Here I've drawn some graphite onto a piece of watercolour paper and I soaked it in some water and then I attached it to some gator board. It's dry now. This piece on the right hasn't been soaked in water. If I wanted to erase or lighten the line drawing on this one that hasn't been soaked in the water, it's quite easy to remove the graphite. I can do the same thing on this one, but I find it's not quite as easy to remove. I'll go back to this one, and it comes virtually back to white paper. But this one still has a slight faint mark on the paper where the graphite has been. So that's why I usually put my drawing on the paper after I've stretched it. Okay, question 3. How do I store my brushes, paints and paintings? I'll start with my brushes. When we built this studio, I included some narrow drawers in the built-in cabinetry, and that's where I store my brushes. I bought a roll of PVC drawer liners, and that stops the brushes from rolling around when I open and close the drawers. I've got my round brushes in one drawer and my flat brushes in another. I separate them into size and type so that I can find them easily. I wash them when I'm finished painting and I wait until they're dry before I store them in the drawers. My paints I store in plastic storage containers. I bought these in a hardware store. They have a lid and they're divided into sections so that I can separate the paint into different hues. So all my yellows are together and all my blues are together, and that makes it easier to find specific colours when I need them. Now my paintings. I store some of them in this old plan cabinet. This was an old plan cupboard that Dom and I bought at an auction years ago. It was in a sorry state. It was rusty and the paint was flaking off. It looked awful. So Dom spent some time restoring it. He spent weeks cutting out all the rust. He fixed all the sliding parts. And he repainted all the individual parts of it. He even made a new timber top for it. And now it sits in my studio looking beautiful, and it's really useful. I can store full sheets of paper in it, and I store some of my finished paintings in it. And I don't know what I'd do without it. I also store some paintings in large plastic containers. These have a lid to keep the dust and creepy crawlies out, and I store them underneath the plan cabinet. Question number 4. What do you use to protect your paintings? Okay, if I finish a painting on paper that is going to be framed with an archival mat behind glass, I don't finish it with anything. When it's ready to be framed, I take it to the framer and the glass will protect it. If you're worried about the colours fading, you can always ask your framer about the glass that is UV protected. It's more expensive than ordinary glass, but it's good for your peace of mind. If I glue watercolour paper to a cradled board and do my painting on that, that painting won't go behind glass, so it needs to be protected. In that case, I use Krylon UV archival spray-on varnish. These rose paintings are painted on paper that I mounted to timber frames, and they have been protected with 3 coats of this varnish. I also protect any paintings that I do on aquaboard in the same way, because they won't be going behind glass either. Question number 5, and this is a painting technique question. Why do my paints not spread and move on the wet paper like yours do? I enjoy using the wet on wet technique when I paint, and I love to see the paint creep over the wet paper. The colours blend effortlessly together. The paint flows by itself and creates some beautiful effects. Sometimes beginners may have difficulty getting the paint to spread or move over the wet paper the way it does for me when I paint. If you find your paint doesn't creep over wet paper, it's probably because of your water to paint ratio. I'll get some paint and I'll show you what I mean. I have some freshly squeezed magenta here. I place it on the palette and I mix some water with it so that I get a puddle of paint that moves around on the palette. So if I tilt the palette, that paint will move around in the puddle. I'll use some water to wet a small section in my journal. Then I fully load my brush in the paint mixture. I use a wet brush to pick the paint up. And then I paint straight into that wet area. You can see how the paint moves and creeps over the paper. Now, some beginners tell me when they do that, the paint doesn't move like that. It tends to stay in position more. I'll wet another section. And this time I'll make a puddle of paint that doesn't have quite as much water mixed into it. I'll put a small amount of water now. So then when I paint on the paper, the paint's not going to move as much because it's not as fluid. It tends to stay in place more. So it could be the water to paint ratio. It could also be how wet the paper is. Maybe you haven't wetted enough. It could also be the wetness level of your brush. Maybe it was too dry when you picked the paint up. It could also be the paper that you're using. If the paint is not doing what you want it to do, adjust something, experiment. Take note of how wet your brush is, how wet your paper is, and how much water that you have in your paint mixture. So there you are. That's all I've got for you today. I hope it was helpful to you. I'll see you in the next video. Hi everyone, welcome. Which bit?
Just flatten it.
Here?
Yeah.
That's something inside the mouth. They're asking me that.
Well, let's start with Louise. What pencil colour do you use?
Louise,
Yeah.
what pencil colour do you use under
What pencil do
watercolour?
you use?
Huh?
Louise, what pencil colour do you use? What pencil do you use? Or whatever.
Well, I don't know what to
Just
do.
say, Louise, what pencil colour do you use?
Did that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I just do it again. It just didn't make sense in my head. This one. How do I do that? Like that?
Yeah.
When we built this studio,
This studio.